Whenever you work with data binding, the first thing you need is a data source. We're going to work with the data inspector, which is the inspector below the files inspector. There are two types of data sources that the Windows Presentation Foundation recognizes: XML data sources and CLR object data sources. We're going to work with an XML data source, so I'm going to click the button. A dialog comes up asking for the information for my XML data source. I'm going to name this data source. In this case, I'm going to name it product list. I also need to specify a URL for my XML data. I'm going to click the Browse button, and in the project folder directory, under Lesson 5, you're going to find the product's XML file. I'm going to press OK, and now in the Data Inspector, the product list and my sections, the first node in the XML file, is displayed. I'm going to take a look in the XAML document for a moment, and you'll see under the resources for the window, the XML data provider has been created. However, if I scroll to the right, you'll see that the source contains the full path to my XML document. This would work just fine so long as I was working on my machine, but if I tried to give this to somebody else, they wouldn't be able to use it unless they had this exact directory structure. So I'm going to go back to the design space, and I'm going to delete that data source, because that's not what I want. When I press the Subtract Data, Blend asks me if I'm sure I want to delete the data source. In this case, I do. If you want to have your data source local to your project, the way to do that is to first add it to your project. We've added project files before, so I'm going to right-click on my project and add an existing item. I'm going to once again go to my desktop, go to my project files, Part 1 in Lesson 5, and select my XML file. Now, when I add my XML, I'm going to name it again product list. But when I add the URL, I'm just going to type products.xml. Since I'm not specifying a path, and this XML document exists in my project, it'll be connected to the XML file locally in the project. Now when I look in the XAML, you'll see that the source simply says products.xml. This means that the XML file will be local, and I'll have direct access to it. In the Data Inspector, let's take a look at what I have. I have my product list data source, and under it, a node named Sections. To understand what this means, let's take a look at what the products.xml file actually looks like. I'm going to right-click it and choose Edit Externally. This will bring up whatever editor you currently have configured for XML files. In my case, I've got Notepad. In my XML file, the first node is Sections, then Extras, and then a group of extra regions. Each extra region has a name, a description, an image, and a price. Now when I close this, I can expand Sections, and you'll see Extras and Extra Array. The Extra Array means that there are multiple nodes of the name Extra inside my XML file. If I expand that node, you'll see the description, image, name, and price that each extra had with it. The schema for the XML data source was inferred by Blend. It looked in the XML file and figured out all of the nodes and gave its best guess. Now that I've got my list, I want to create a control so that my user can choose one of the extra items. So I'm going to click and drag the extra array onto my artboard. When I release, a menu with several options comes up. I could bind my extra array directly to the grid, or I could create a new control, a combo box, items control, and so on, to represent the extra. I'm going to choose a list box. The next dialog that comes up is asking what property of the list box I want to bind the extra to. All this is asking is which property I want to connect to my data. For list boxes, in most cases, you want to connect the item source. So I'm going to press OK.